Alright, welcome to the channel. My name's James and today I'm going to give you my top 3 tips and tricks to help you master your brushes. Let's get into it. We can use the brush to create countless different effects across the model, from smooth blends to crispy edge highlights, battle damage and textured cloth, and pretty much anything you can imagine, but only once you master the fundamentals. Just to make sure we're all on the same page, we're going to break down the brush. So the brush is made up of a few main components. You've got the handle, these vary in size, weight and material. You've got the ferrule, which is where you glue the head of the brush or the bristles into the brush, and then you've got the head. The head consists of the belly and the tip. Best way to think about the belly is like a reservoir that holds all of your paint, all of your water, all of your medium whenever you're painting. And this can be made up of natural hairs, synthetic hairs, or a combination of both. And the tip is just the tip. As I mentioned earlier, your brush can be made up of natural hairs, synthetic hairs, and a mixture of both. There are a number of positives and negatives associated with both, so we'll just quickly run through those. Natural hair brushes benefit from the shape and structure of the hair and how they align towards a point. This makes them more durable, more absorbent, and better at holding a tip. Now there are a couple of drawbacks, mainly around the price, where they can get quite expensive and they don't always align with people's ethical views. Synthetic brushes, on the other hand, tend to be a lot more cost effective, they're cruelty free, but the downsides are they're not as durable and not as absorbent as a natural hair brush. Alright, now we're all on the same page and understand the different components of a brush, we can get into the tips and tricks. So let's start with number 1, loading your brush. So whenever I'm starting to paint, I like to prepare my area. I'll fill up my wet palette and apply a new sheet of parchment paper. I generally don't like to use the one from the day before or the paint from the day before because it can get a wee bit weird. And then the main important part is that I use a sheet of kitchen paper alongside this. So paints come in a number of different consistencies with different mediums, and they all have different properties. Now if you'd like me to break down paint consistencies and some of the properties in more detail in a future video, please let me know in the comments, but today we'll just be using acrylic paint. When you're loading your brush, it's important that you don't get any of the paint down into the ferrule. Like I mentioned earlier, this is where they glue the head or the bristles into the brush. If you get paint down in this area, it can damage the brush and cause it to splay and really just lose its shape. Ideally, you want to be loading it to about 2/3 or halfway up the bristles. Now when I'm loading my brush, I'm working it through the paint, pulling it down towards myself. I'm twisting the brush to ensure all of the bristles are evenly loaded and the paint is well distributed throughout the brush. Now you can see that the brush is well saturated with paint and moisture. It's still holding its shape, but what I like to do is just touch my brush to a piece of paper towel while twisting it. This ensures we remove the excess moisture and excess paint, and the brush really aligns to its natural shape and you get that really sharp tip. You can also see that the brush is correctly loaded to halfway to 2/3 up the bristles and none of the paint has got into the ferrule. Now before applying your paint, you may have seen some people test it out on their thumb to ensure they've got the right consistency and coverage before applying it to the model. So now we know how to load our brush correctly, it's time to get on to tip number 2, controlling the brush. Controlling the paint coming off the brush is really down to practice. It's a feeling and something you have to build up with muscle memory, and it varies depending on the type of brush, type of paint, the palette and the surface you're applying the paint to. Where you hold the brush, the angle, the amount of pressure, how you start the stroke, how you finish the stroke, all have an effect on how the paint is applied to the miniature. Now generally we'll all start off holding the brush the same way we do a pen, and you'll have to forgive me here because I hold a pen in a very weird way. But I generally hold the brush around the ferrule. I'm controlling the brush with my wrist and my fingers, and sometimes I'll be using my elbow to achieve certain patterns. And this varies depending on the type of effect, texture, or stroke I'm looking to achieve on the model. And I'll adjust my position on the brush, my angle, how I start my stroke, how I finish my stroke, and the pressure depending on the effect that I'm looking to create. Now we're going to quickly look at how you hold your brush and manipulate the brush to do a number of basic painting techniques. Alright, whenever I start painting, I like to have a nice stable base, and that comes from using miniature holders or even corks will work fine. These holders allow me to position the model in such a way and hold it where I'm able to use the entirety of my hand to create a nice stable base. I'm able to then lean against the holder, potentially the cork, the armature, and brace my hands against each other or use at least counteracting forces from my hands where I can build stability. Now whenever I'm doing this, I have my arms on the desk, and then I have the model roughly just under head height or around shoulder height, and I find that this allows me to work best. So you may prefer to have one hand on the desk where you can lean against the surface and then rest your other hand on top of that. Or you may prefer to have your hands close into your body with your wrists against the edge of the desk, almost bracing against your core. Now, all of these approaches work, and they all work really well. It just depends which one is the best for you. So let's have a closer look at what's actually happening whenever we're applying the brush to the surface. So we're going to start off pulling the brush towards ourselves, using our fingers to manipulate the brush. Now I'm doing this quite slowly, and you can see the brush almost splaying out, the paint coming from the belly and being applied to the surface. Whenever I lift the brush away, there's a small deposit of paint left at the end that's slightly larger than the rest of the stroke. Now this happens because of the speed of the stroke. If I was to apply the paint faster with lighter pressure, you can see that I get a thinner line and it almost tapers towards the end. You're not left with that larger deposit at the end of the stroke. So although we're performing the same action with our fingers, you can see that the final result is quite a bit different due to the speed and pressure that we use. And now what if we were to approach the surface from a different angle? Here we're using more of the side of the brush to apply the paint, kind of pulling it again across the surface, using our fingers to mainly manipulate the brush, but also a small amount of wrist, just to ensure we're keeping that line. You can see we get a broader stroke. The deposit at the end isn't necessarily as present, and because of how we're lifting the brush away, the end of the stroke is different. So when it comes to base coating, we're loading our brush, working it through the paint, and then dabbing it on the paper towel. So we're gripping the brush somewhat down the ferrule, and then we're pulling the brush towards our hand using our fingers. This should create a reasonably straight up and down stroke, and depending on how you hold the brush, if you hold it in more of a conventional way, it should look something like this. But you can see again it comes from pivoting and hinging of the fingers to create that straight up and down brush stroke. So sometimes you might find yourself in a position where you can't perform the straight up and down brush stroke, and you have to approach it from a slightly different direction where you're using the side of the brush to apply your base layers. Again, we're using the hand, but there's a small rocking motion coming in here as well. So we're combining that with the wrist and potentially the elbow. So let's just say, for instance, we had this larger, flatter surface, and again I'm trying to achieve the same sort of base coat. So I'm loading my brush in the same way, dabbing it off on the paper towel. Whenever I come to the surface, I'm holding my brush further back away from the ferrule, so this amplifies the movement that I'm making with my fingers, moving the head of the brush a lot further with each stroke, allowing me to cover more area with less time. And now if I'm gripping a lot closer to the ferrule, you can see that I can only really cover half the range with the same amount of movement in my fingers. So what I have here is a size 8, just random synthetic size 8 that I have lying about in my collection. And instead of following the same process where I'm covering by pulling the same directional stroke, what I'm going to do here is I'm going to move the brush side to side. And this isn't really a hand movement. This is actually coming more from the wrist and from the elbow. So again, I'm just going to come in, I'm going to hold further back because it gives me a larger range of movement. And we're just going to quickly block in a lot of this surface, using these wobbling movements. And these originate from the wrist and from the elbow. So we can use this motion from the wrist and from the elbow whenever it comes to wet blending. So I'm just slapping down some corn red really quickly, grabbing our brighter red, and again using that same movement from the wrist, from the elbow, to push the paints together to create those wet blends. So we're using the side of the brush here and not the tip in order to achieve this result. So say we want to create some more interesting texture in our marine here, and we're going to use a slightly brighter color. So say we want to create some stipples on the shoulder pad. Now whenever I'm stippling, I like to almost pivot against my pinky finger by resting it against the armature of the hobby holder, or against the hobby holder or the cork. This way I find I have the most stability and I can originate the stroke more from the wrist or from the elbow, and this gives me good accuracy whenever I'm applying my dots. I also like to hold the brush further down the ferrule, probably gripping with a bit more pressure to ensure I create that stability within the stroke. So you'll see while I'm doing this, I'm keeping my pinky finger stationary and then I'm moving my other fingers to position the tip of the brush relative to the model. Now say I want to create something that has more of that scratchy, irregular feel to it, I'll be holding the brush away from the ferrule and with lighter pressure. This allows the brush to more freely flow and move across the model, where I can create more of those scratches and more of those irregular shapes as I'm building up the texture on the model. So you can see the brush strokes are quite quick, there's almost a bit of a frantic energy to it, and we're really working with the tip of the brush. Now say you wanted to, pull some lines, say you wanted to do hatching as an approach. So this is very much in the fingers and requires you to have a nice stable base either against your hobby holder, the armature, or the desk. It's very much that up and down stroke that we were using when we were base coating, but this time we're doing it faster with lighter pressure to create those parallel lines, to create that almost brush steel look or hatching look. And if we grip further away from the ferrule, we can create longer lines with the same amount of movement in our fingers. Alright, so say you want to create some strong edge highlights along your model, you're going to load your brush same way as you did before, but this time we're going to position our brush so it is perpendicular to the surface. So we want to use the side of the brush and run that along the edge of the model. And you can see this is a bit more of like a rocking motion than it is just using my fingers to manipulate the brush. So there may still be times where you need to trace an edge. Whenever you're doing that, it's better to grip closer to the ferrule so you can control the stroke with more accuracy and then trace over the edge using the tip of the brush. Alright, say I wanted to soften out this transition in the shoulder pad and I want to do that with a glaze. I create the glaze on my palette, load my brush in the same way, ensure that everything is evenly coated, and then dab off the excess moisture onto a paper towel. Whenever I'm applying the glaze, I want to use the side of the brush because I can create a nice soft surface. The weight is more evenly distributed and it's a bit easier to control the amount of paint coming off. So you can see I'm using the side of my brush, I'm pulling the brush towards myself in this instance, but you can also do it moving the brush away from yourself because you're using the side of the brush and not the tip. And again, you can see I start off holding quite far back from the ferrule, but you can also work in closer depending on the size of the stroke that you need to create. And finally, let's have a look at some dry brushing. So I like to hold my dry brushes back from the ferrule to ensure that I can create nice light pressure and deposit a small amount of paint. So I like to move more from the elbow, more from the wrist, mostly whenever I'm dry brushing. This allows me to cover more area and again leave nice small deposits. You can also do this from your fingers the same way as you would if you were performing any other stroke, pulling the brush towards yourself. Again, like I said, I like to do this side to side motion, this rocking motion from the elbow, because I find it helps me to create nice even and consistent strokes whenever it comes to dry brushing. Each of these techniques requires a slightly different movement, grip, angle, pressure and speed. So it's worth noting at times you may have all of these things correct but you're still not achieving the desired effect, and it could be down to the fact you're just using the wrong brush. So every brush has different properties and you really got to take the time to find the brushes that are right for you. And this takes us on to tip number 3, choosing the right brush for the job. There are a number of different brushes you can use to apply paint to your minis. You've got rounds, miniatures, riggers, fans, flats, swords, synthetic brushes, natural hair brushes, blends, dry brushes, and the list just goes on and on. Each of these brushes has different characteristics and properties that you need to consider when deciding what brush to use. So where do you start when picking a brush? The first thing you want to consider is the size and shape. Generally you want to try and use the biggest brush possible to complete the job, and only go smaller if you need to get in tighter for very, very small details. We've all been told bigger is better, and I'm sorry to tell you, it is true. Using a bigger brush will allow you to spend more time painting because it can hold more paint and water in the belly, which means less back and forth to the palette and more painting. I tried painting this marine shoulder with a 5-0 here just to prove a point, and this is at 3 times speed and I could not subject myself to it any longer. So please use a bigger brush. A large Kolinsky sable brush will generally have a super sharp point as well, so be able to tackle all of those small details. If you're using synthetic brushes, you may have to drop down to a smaller size. The next thing you need to consider is the quality or characteristics of the bristles. Are they stiff enough? Do they have enough spring? Do they have enough bounce? Are they soft enough to achieve the blend that you want? These are a number of things that you have to ask yourself whenever you're choosing a brush, and also whether or not you need to be using a synthetic brush or a natural hair brush. Now I'd recommend everyone start off with synthetic brushes due to the fact that they are super cost effective. You can pick up like 10 synthetic brushes on Amazon for the same price as a larger sable brush. So you need to think about what kind of paint you're going to be using. There are a number of different mediums and thinners available to us, from oils, acrylics, alcohols and enamels, and these all impact your brushes in different ways. You don't want to be using your sable brushes whenever you're using these more abrasive mediums and thinners. It's a surefire way to wreck your brush. Instead, you want to grab some synthetics and just go to town. Having a good selection of brushes makes your life a lot easier, but you'll tend to find that you keep going back to the same 2 or 3 brushes, so it's good to stock up on those and have a good supply. So if you're like me, I like to have one large brush so I can quickly sketch out a lot of work and get information on the model quite quickly. Then having a smaller brush, maybe like a 2 down to a 0, somewhere in that region for more detailed work, and then maybe down to a 00 for some really fine line work. I tend to prefer Kolinsky sable brushes because I think they have a nicer feel, they have a nice bounce, they hold a lot of paint, a lot of moisture, so it means I can keep working for longer periods of time. They have good durability and hold a really sharp point. At the minute I'm using quite a lot of Artist Series S brushes because I like the feel, I like the weight, and I just generally like how the brush performs. Now this is different for everyone, and it's important that you try different brushes from different manufacturers to really find out what works for you. It could be that you like certain brushes from certain manufacturers for certain things. Maybe like Raphael's are really good for glazing and blending because they have a really soft bounce and not too much spring, so you can get very soft, even coats of paints, especially when you're using super thin layers. It's important to remember that sizing is not universal, so a size 2 from one manufacturer may not be the same as a size 2 from another. It's also important to try different shapes of brushes. You may prefer a Series M or a miniature series because there's less flex. You may prefer a rigger, which has more flex and longer bristles. There's a number of different brushes out there, so it's important that you try all of them. So now we're on to tip number 4 maybe, or maybe this is just a bonus tip, but this is about brush care and cleaning. It's important to take good care of your brushes and invest in new ones regularly. Brushes are a consumable part of the hobby, and they will break and they will lose their tip. It's just inevitable, you can't stop it. Good brush care will extend the life of your brushes and keep the tip for longer, but even after your brush has lost its tip, it still has a use. You can use it for base coating, mixing, weathering, applying washes, and a load of other things, so not all paintbrushes deserve the bin. I'm going to run you through my preventative actions and how I clean my brushes. I don't do this after every session, generally I do it after a really heavy painting session where I've been at it for hours. Alright, so one of the best tips I ever got was a drop or 2 of washing up liquid in your paint water. This just helps to break down some of the paint material that gets stuck in your brush throughout the session and just helps to give it a bit of a better clean. It does also change the surface tension of your paints, so do keep that in mind, but also a drop or 2 of this in your wet palette is a big help for fighting mold and any funky smells. So when it comes to cleaning your brush, all you really need is some soap and a paper towel. I like to either use the Masters brush cleaner or the brush soap that comes with the Artist Opus brushes. Both of these are very readily available and both work extremely well. So whenever you open them, it's basically just a block of plain soap, and you can use either of these to clean your brushes. It doesn't really matter which one you use or which one you prefer. You can see that I've used them both, and I always clean them out with a paper towel after I've finished using them to ensure there's no debris or matter stuck. Then I'll wet my brush, I'll run it through the soap multiple times. Now depending on how soft or hard your water is will depend on the lather that you get from it. But I'll run it through multiple times, pulling it towards myself each time, very similar to how I would almost load my brush on the palette. And then I will run it over the paper towel to remove any hard debris or any dry debris from the brush, and then just repeat this process multiple times until I'm satisfied that the brush has been cleaned properly. So once I'm happy that my brush has been cleaned, I'll clean out the soap and any excess water with the edge of the paper towel just to remove any debris, any dirt or anything that's on top of the soap. Then I'll wet my brush one more time and I'll pull it through the clean soap to condition the brush, and I'll leave this overnight for the brush to dry and ensure that it maintains its shape. So get the brush loaded with the soap, run it over the paper towel to remove the excess moisture and excess soap and shape it correctly. And then one more time I'll just drag it through the soap to make sure I've got a nice sharp point at the end of my brush, and I can leave it to dry overnight. And that's pretty much all that I do for my regular brushes. And if I'm cleaning my dry brushes, I'm doing pretty much the same thing. I'm going to wet it in the water. I'm going to work it into the Masters brush series soap just because it's a bit easier. It's easier to build up a lather with something this size. And then I'm going to again run it over the paper towel to remove any debris, any excess dirt. Repeat the process a couple of times until I'm satisfied that the brush is clean, and that's pretty much it. So I just want to remind you that this takes practice, and it takes a good bit of practice. It is a difficult hobby, but it's a super rewarding hobby. Every brush can do different things and some of the same things, so it's important to play around with the different strokes and experiment with the brushes you have at your disposal. And it doesn't need to be a simple stroke or the most obvious stroke for that brush. For example, could you edge highlight with a flat brush? Could you create texture with a dry brush or a round brush? Could you pull fine lines and thick lines with a large brush? These are all things that you can try out and experiment for yourself. Hopefully you found that useful. If you have any comments, questions or suggestions for future videos, please drop them below in the comments. And if you want to take your painting to the next level, I have a Patreon that's focused around feedback and coaching. You also get access to exclusive guides and content. If you want to show me what you've been working on or what you've been using these videos for, please head over to the Discord and drop some pics into the whips or the completed projects. I would love to see what you've been doing. Just want to say thank you again for watching, and I'll catch you at the next one.
All links can be found below in the description, and don't forget to like and subscribe.